So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us all. I am here with one of my heroes in the world of governance, and that is George Cuff. He is an international management consultant, a speaker, and an author, and the master of all things governance. And I have, since I've been involved in politics, I've wanted to be George Cuff when I grow up. So. So I'm pretty pleased to be speaking with George. We're going to have a conversation about leadership and some of the changes that George has seen over his career. He, like myself, was a former politician and now has been working all over the world in the world of governance. So George, I'm going to start off by asking you one question, and that is, what's one thing about you that might surprise people, that people don't know about you?
Well, they probably don't know that I'm a very kind and doting grandfather to 6 grandchildren who think I'm actually a pretty nice guy, which is not something that would be used to describe me in a lot of client situations. So they might be shocked and surprised that I have this other side to me that allows me to be kind and compassionate where I need to be, and to be supportive to grandchildren and children, even when I question their choices, and think about how much smarter they could be if they were me, and they would have made all the right choices, which of course I never made in my lifetime, in my history. There are a whole lot of choices, Christina, that I wish I could take back and redo and think about, but we aren't given those blessings. We're challenged to press on from where we're at. So I've always taken that approach to what I do. You know, in terms of other things that don't necessarily get announced, I mean, I've got a speed bag up in the corner behind me, which allows me to work out to my heart's content. And I did that for 12 years while I was mayor, which, by the way, I was also a management consultant at the same time. So the mayor's role was morning, noon hours, evenings, weekends. I had one member of council that infuriated me for 12 years. Not really. I mean, he was a considerable challenge. And I would come home and paint his imaginary face on my speed bag and work out. I was at one time a Golden Gloves boxing champion, so that's takes you back to 1970. And I was also had 7 high school records in quarter mile, half mile, and mile in those days, now described differently in metric terms. And so I told people if I couldn't outfight them, I could outrun them. I just needed to decide what to do first.
Oh my gosh, I
So
love that.
all of those were good skills for today's environment. And anyway, they've positioned me to be the person that I am.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, one of the things you said about, you know, we can't redo the past, but the beautiful thing
Yeah.
is that we're always learning from our experiences.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like if we're smart, we are learning
Yeah.
from our experiences and then doing things differently moving forward. Right?
Yes.
That's the human condition, and we can either ignore the lessons, or we can embrace the lessons, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So one of the things, as many of the people who are going to be listening to this, one of the things that I care very deeply about is political leadership. And I care deeply about sustainability and good quality, high functioning leadership teams. And so I'm curious to know, what does political leadership mean to you? And maybe what you can also do is tell us a little bit about, I mean, you've been in this career for a long time. And what are some of the changes that you have seen in terms of political leadership in local government over the span of your career?
So a couple of background remarks. One would be that some things have changed over my career that have somewhat surprised me, other things that haven't surprised me very much. The human condition is as it is. So we might gloss it over. I went from talking about roles and responsibilities in the late 70s to now talking governance. It really was the same thing, same language. We've dressed it up somewhat, we've changed the terminology, but the same principles that I wrote about in the earlier days. I mean, I've been doing consulting for 42 years. 37 on my own. And, there's a whole lot of things that you learn over that span of time, but one of which is that many people don't change in terms of their basic aspirations, their basic way of approaching things. Political leaders have a particular time horizon. It's called the next election. And so whenever I see people putting together long-term strategic plans, which I'm not even sure council should be involved in, but anyway, long-term, I'll talk about that, long-term strategic plans of 5, 10, 15, 20 years, I'm thinking politicians aren't really, to be quite candid, that interested. They want to know, what are we doing now? What impact are we having now? And how can I help sell that going into the next election? And it's very much driven by, I want to be successful in the minds and the face of those that I'm elected by. I want them to know that I'm concerned about their issues, and their issues are today's issues, which is why management, to my mind, has got to have a very good long-term view and understand how all these pieces fit together and what decisions council makes and how they're going to impact the future. So management needs to walk this very fine line between advising and dictating. Advising and telling council what it is they should be approving and baptizing, and which is again another reason why I resist some of what I see going on in strategic planning. I think council should be involved in strategic thinking, and management should be involved in strategic planning. They should be the ones putting the plans together. They should be the ones figuring out which way the roadway should run appropriately according to engineering standards. That's not a council prerogative. A council prerogative is where are we going to expand to as a municipality? What direction are we going to go? And are we going to grow up or are we going to grow out? Those are decisions to be made by political leaders. How we get there in terms of what roadways need to be designed, what utilities need to be buried underground, all of those kinds of things are day-to-day managerial decisions that are based on a longer-term management plan. So I think sometimes we need to sort of get a reset and think about what are we actually in this quote business for? What are the citizens expecting us to do as political leaders? And are we providing that kind of quality direction? So I think, one of the things that's changed over time is that management has become much more sophisticated. Management has become, by and large, better educated. There are fewer and fewer CAOs or managers that lack professional accreditation of some kind.
Yeah.
In the old days, that was the predominant number. I mean, as long as you're a bookkeeper, you could be a manager. And in many small communities had that for years and years and years, where you'd have the guy with the visor on his head and 8 pens across the front of his pocket, and that was your manager of the day.
Yeah.
And now you've got people that actually look the part, which also bothers me, by the way. I'm rather old school because I think if you're going to be a CAO manager, you ought to at least look the part. You ought to look like you're earning your 150,000 a year or more. And anyway, I think that this has become big business. So I think what's happened is that managers and department heads have grown up and being better business people, more focused on being professional. When I say business, I mean the business of local government, being more professional, whereas councillors come at it from still the same backgrounds that they always did. They're on the street kind of people, that's just where they came from. And they walk in and management presumes that they're going to know something about governance as they walk in the front door. And the answer is they don't.
Yeah.
And that's a second major concern that I have with managers, is that in addition to not understanding strategic thinking, they don't understand governance. And so they spend their time sucking councillors into day-to-day management. And then they phone me and say, George, what's happened? I got my management councils too involved in day-to-day management. And I always go back to the same thing. I say, send me a copy of your orientation outline and I'll tell you where the problem is. Simple. And the orientation outline, I mean, I remember seeing one in Southern Alberta where item 1 was introduce council to the members of the fire department.
Yeah. Why? Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, so you might have had that as item number 30, but that's not item number 1 in terms of a council that has no idea about governance, and you're going to get them involved in, how do you climb the pole at the fire department? I just, to me, is how do you hold the hose? We've really missed it. And quite frankly, management is its own worst problem and own worst enemy, because they haven't fully understood what it means to govern. I could go across Canada and teach the same courses. Everybody would sit there and say, oh, that makes all the sense in the world. But very few of them pick up on that and say, so how does that change what I'm doing as a CAO manager? Anyway, I've gone probably far past what you wanted me to. So.
No, well, you're totally speaking my language, and this, there's a couple things actually that I want to grab onto, because I think that are really key. And I agree, sometimes management is guilty of inviting council and elected officials into places that they shouldn't invite them. The other thing that I want to pick up on that you said around strategic thinking versus strategic planning, and that is that it's so key for staff to ask strategic questions, I think, of council, and actually and don't claim that you don't have any direction. Ask for that strategic direction, and that's where the strategic thinking comes in. The other thing that I kind of wanted to touch in on, because this is again something that's super important to me, is and you talked about elected officials. They want to please the people that have elected them, and they're focused on being able to make a difference during their short time in office. However, as you know, we've got all this, when you put services in place and you build infrastructure and you continue to add more and more assets and services to the plate of local government. And then if you don't, if you build it, you bloody well better be prepared to maintain it and to look after it and operate it, and then have a plan to renew it, because you've created expectations with the public that you're going to provide this service. And so you've got to have a plan. And so is it possible to develop a leadership mindset that has a long-term view in elected officials? And what are those leadership attributes and competencies that are so key to that, both the short-term thinking and the long-term thinking?
And again, if I were to come at this as a CAO, as a manager, as a department head, I would say, how do I get council to understand that the decisions they're making today have a lot longer term shelf life than they may think they do? So I would be asking them the questions that allow us to get to where we ought to get. It's the what questions. What do we do next? What are we going to do in terms of infill, in terms of growth upward versus outward? Those are the what questions. Management should be very content to themselves to say, once we've got this sense of what, i.e. the policy level questions and policy level discussions, we're quite competent at putting the how together. The how is the managerial directives. The how is, how do we get from this point to the next point? If we can get council to understand the futurity of present day decisions, which is what it was described in some text that makes me sound more intelligent than I am. But the futurity of present day decisions is really what you need to inculcate inside a council, to say, the decisions we're making have a much longer shelf life than you or I, and have an impact. When I was mayor and we described this, we became a city of Spruce Grove. I mean, little did I understand what that really meant. We went from 7,000 population when I started to 14,000. And I thought, boy, that's unbelievable. At one time, it was the highest growth percentage in Canada. And we're now at 35,000. I mean, it's a massive remake of an overall community. So did we do it right? Well, I would like to think that because you set in place certain standards, certain development agreements, certain longer term thinking, certain decisions around what are we going to do with parkland, all of those are basic, fundamental, policy-oriented, strategic thinking decisions. Providing you make those ones, the day-to-day stuff is not your bailiwick as a politician. That's not what you're into. At least you shouldn't be. And where councils fall apart, in my view, is when they start looking inward on agendas and start questioning paragraph 18 or whatever. I mean, I did a review of a municipality. I won't say who because it's embarrassing, but I did a review of a municipality not that long ago where they sent me a copy of their what I call Governance and Priorities Committee, a committee of the whole agenda package, 904 pages.
Yeah.
Now you have to think to yourself, did we elect council members who we thought were librarians or scientists, or did we elect council members who we thought we were going to have to manage information?
Yeah.
And managing information that goes to council means a good agenda package is 30 pages. It covers the key issues, it provides the key options, it provides a quality recommendation that says, from an administrative point of view, do this.
Yeah.
That's what I want to hear from a senior manager. I don't want them to say, here's 3 options, council, choose one. That's gutless.
Mm.
I want somebody as management that can say, we've analyzed this.
Mhm.
There are 3 key options that could work, any one of them. But the one we prefer and the one we think makes the most sense is this one. And then you allow politicians to say, no, in terms of public perception, in terms of the consumption of the public, we think option C is better than A, and we're going to vote for C. That to me is a decision you leave to your politicians who have supposedly a better sense of the public than you do. You're focused on what makes administratively good sense.
Yeah.
And if people could keep that separation in their mind and say, well, so why are we on such different pages? I don't think you are. You both want the best for the community. You come at it from 2 entirely different vantage points. So when you're talking political leadership, you're talking people that can make choices based on what's in the best long-term interests. And sometimes that goes against today's thinking by the body politic, the community itself. You sometimes have to be strong enough to stand up and say, no, I think this is in our overall best long-term interest. Today is simply today.
Yeah.
And we're going to rue the day that we make a decision based on today and not longer term. So our role as politicians is to provide an education base. You know, I just came in from the outside talking to a neighbor about, well, why do people, George, make the decisions they do? Get to ask my neighbor of me, knowing that I'm involved in this kind of stuff. And I say, well, it's because they don't consider sort of longer term consequences. They make a decision based on the here and now rather than saying what's out there. I think that's partly a role for management. It's also a role for council members. I'm not excusing council. I think council's got to think ahead. They've got to grasp the uncertainties that lie ahead and say, our job is to help navigate down the path. Management's job is to help put the things in place that make all of this come together. You talk about asset management. I would say council's job is to say, we're here to preserve community assets.
Yes.
We're here to make sure that they go on for a certain lifetime.
Yeah.
Any council that says we're not going to increase taxes from what we're at today, I think is in some ways foolish, because when I stand up and deliver a seminar, I tell them the very building I'm standing in is a public building, and underground are the utilities that are aging. And if you're not doing something to put aside money for the future aging of this facility, you're foolish, because at some point it's going to catch up to you.
Yeah.
So what are we doing in terms of thinking through to the future rather than simply focusing on the here and now? So I think that it's a council leadership focus. It's a council where to from here focus. And it's a management saying, if that's true, we need to put these building blocks in place to get us there safely. That's a combined focus.
Yeah. One of the things that I always say is that, you know, elected officials, your job is the what and the why, and staff is the who and the how, right?
Yeah.
And there's this semi-permeable line. And when, you know, you talk about having a 900-page agenda, I think that's a sign of a lack of trust and a lack of understanding around what strategic decision making is all about. Right.
Yeah.
And to me, it's really tempting to get, like, we can wrap our head around the tangible, right? And that's why, you know, staff invite council and council dive into those day-to-day decisions, because thinking philosophically and strategically it takes a little bit of work. But elected officials, their job is to think. And one of the things that I've been thinking about myself in terms of political leadership is the need to have those brave, bold conversations, particularly with the public, around things like, you know, around taxes and connecting the dots between we pay taxes and we receive these services, you know, and connecting making that linkage between service levels and cost to provide that services. Your taxes are high because the service levels are high, right?
Yes. Yeah. I think a part of the job is the communication of the council with its public. And again, without relegating councils and saying they're not doing a good job of anything, I would argue that one of the fundamental roles of a council is to continue on communicating with the public. That's what got you to the dance. That's what's going to keep you in the dance, is your
Yes.
ability to engage and communicate. It's not, the public is not impressed by how many hours you spend in City Hall.
Yeah.
And this whole notion that you got elected, now you're down to City Hall or District Hall, and that's where the world happens. It's
Mhm.
simply not true. Where the world happens is where the public is at. So let's find ways. Let's look at our overall structure of governance, including our use of boards and committees and agencies and so on, and say, what role do they play? When I ask management that, they can't even come up with a one paragraph saying what individual boards and committees do. They simply get councillors reappointed for the next term. I say, so why would we do this?
Yeah.
What role do they have? What impact do they have on council decision making? If they have no impact, let's cut them out altogether. It's a brand new term. Drop the whole works and then decide which ones of those did we actually need, or can we combine them together? That's governance thinking.
Yeah.
That's saying, how do we add value to our decision making by doing this? Do we carry on longstanding boards and committees, or do we have a community roundtable once a quarter and put 3 items in front of the community and say, these are big issues. Let's talk about the big issues of the day. You
Yeah.
give us some input and we'll end up taking that forward in terms of a policy and so on. Let's put a draft report in front of the public. Let's let them bash it around for a while and then bring together a group of 30 to 40 key thinkers in the community and business leaders and community leaders and so on. And we'll get a pretty good cross section of what the community thinks about any given issue. Instead of that, we go through age-old standard hidebound traditions and we carry on year after year as though somehow as part of the municipal act. Well, most of this stuff has nothing to do with legislation. It has everything. I say to people, well, why do you have a seconder of motions? You've only got 5 people at the table. Geez, you got a seconder of a motion. You only got 3 people left to decide if it's right or wrong. So why not just can second? Oh, can we do that? I said, sure, the procedure bylaw is yours. It says that in the act. It says you're to create a procedure bylaw. Instead of that, you've opted out for foolishness and you've gone with the Roberts rules or Bourneau's rules, which apply to much larger organizations. And instead of that, we're trying to dance around a procedure bylaw that stops you from making good decisions. Like, just think and ask the question, why are we doing this? To me, that's political leadership, is questioning. There's a great quote that comes out of the 2003, I think it is, Harvard Business Review article by a guy by the name of Heifetz and Laurie, I think it was, who wrote this article. They're much smarter people than me, who came up with a quote that said, one can lead with no more than a question in hand. It's a fantastic quote. And if you have a council that can ask good governance questions, not the minute questions. Why do we buy the lumber at Home Hardware versus McLeod's? Who cares? Let's talk about something that's significant.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's what I think has gone off the track for a whole lot of councils, is that they aren't focused on the significant. They're focused on, how do we play games with each other? How do we embarrass each other? How do we come up with a good gotcha question? And we're going to embarrass the CAO or the head of finance or whatever. To what end?
Yeah.
Like, where's the value to the community?
Yes. Yeah.
Anyway.
I love that question, because that's the critical question. Why? Why are we doing this? What problem are we solving? How are we making people's lives better? Right? And that's the overarching question. And you're right, so much time is spent wasted in supposed politicking, when politicians and politics means policy setter, right? It doesn't mean scumbag.
Yeah. Well, exactly. We need to have people that think outwardly, that think in terms of longer term, that think about what impact. If they all walked into a meeting with the same question that they left with, it would be, what value do I add?
Yeah.
And when they left the meeting, they would say, what value did I add?
Yeah.
And
beautiful.
Rather than simply being a warm bum filling the seat, you'd actually be able to say, I asked some good governance questions. I got all of us to start thinking around solutions. I wasn't interested in seeing who was smart and who was dumb. I was interested in making sure we were all brought together. That was what a good mayor would do, would be to lead people toward a common solution that makes sense to all of us.
Yeah.
We can look back and say, yeah, it was a good debate. Yeah, it produced a divided council of 5-4, 6-3, whatever. But so what? The public is probably divided equally on the same topic. I don't care about divided councils as long as they're predictably unpredictable. That's what they ought to be.
Yeah.
Where they're predictably predictable, you got a dysfunctional council. If councils vote 7-0 or whatever their numbers are on every issue, you got to ask yourself, so what are we missing here, folks?
Yeah.
Are we so keen to get consensus that we left out good ideas? People quit thinking because all they're interested in is getting to the end of the agenda. That's the conclusion-focused individual that has no idea what the significance is between start and finish. They just want to get to the end. Well, it's a sad commentary when that happens. Anyway, I got somewhat off track, which I want to do at my late age.
No, believe me, this is my favorite kind of discussion. I've got one more question for you, I think, because one of the, I travel across the country talking about asset management, talking about leadership, and I feel sometimes like I gotta get a lot of head nodding, and I get a lot of heads that nod, but then it feels like there's very little action sometimes.
Right.
And I can imagine, I'm taking a guess that you feel somewhat the same way, right?
Yeah.
That, there's a lot of acknowledgement. Why is it so hard to really take your role, whether it's management or elected official, seriously enough to really learn how to do it well and do it with just with a real level of consciousness?
Yeah, one of the things that, I've spent all these many years trying to teach this, but I haven't done a very good job. But one of the challenges would be for every council to say, how do we add value to our community? What are we doing that our management couldn't do? I mean, we've got some very bright management groups across the country, including in my own community. I presume they know what they're doing day to day. So my question is to a mayor and a council, what's your role in terms of leadership? What's your role in terms of seeing a horizon and trying to figure out what general strokes do we need to get us there?
Yeah.
As opposed to what are the detailed individual decisions which ought to come together at a level that I'm not being paid to handle or to look after. My role is to set this visionary leadership. And yes, and I have to resolve conflicts. I have to resolve issues on a regular basis. That's also part of being a council. I know there's a lot of roll up your sleeves kind of mentality. Some of that's important and predictable. But what else are we doing to add some real value to people? Where are we carving out a path that would be useful for our community, but in both the shorter term and longer term perspective? And part of management's job, in my view, starts at the beginning, starts at the orientation time of a council. You never skip over that. You say, what role are we trying to engage council with? And how do we keep them out of the weeds? Because that's where they naturally go. Because in their own private lives, they're all managers or they're all staff members in some organization. And that's how they think. Now you're elevating them and you're saying, we don't want you down here, which is where you're comfortable. We want you up here. So if I were a management group, I'd be saying, what are the governance questions that I should be putting in every report? What should council discuss? Otherwise, they're going to discuss what it is we just discussed, what it is we just figured out, that the sewage pipe should be 6 feet underground because of frost or whatever. I don't need advice on that.
Yeah.
What I need advice is on, are we connecting with the neighboring community with regard to sewage systems or water systems? Are we sharing whatever in terms of public pathways and bike trails and so on? Those are council decisions. They're not something that we as a management group can orchestrate because they go far past us. They involve a broader level of leadership. So I think, if you're able, Christina, to encourage your clients to figure out that their role is separate and apart from and distinct from management. It's not lesser. It's not necessarily even greater. It's a companion piece. And if we do these two things in balance, we'll end up having much healthier communities and we'll get through all that stuff around who's right and who's wrong in an individual decision. How did I embarrass the mayor? And why would we want to do that? I want the face of the community to be a positive face. So how do How do we do that as a council? How do we provide quality governance, quality strategic thinking, and we get good results? And I can step back from my term of office and think, you know, we made some very good decisions. When I reflect on my 12 years as mayor, there's no way that I would ever reflect on an individual council discussion on a minute piece of information. I've talked about parkways. We've talked about creating a whole 60-acre park. All we did was assemble the land. We didn't design the park. Somebody else was left to do that.
Yeah.
You know, we ended up creating trail systems and so on. We ended up deciding where schools go. We ended up having a live arts theater built onto our composite high school. Those are all council level decisions.
Yeah.
Because it required some degree of thinking that was more future oriented, that was broader based.
Yeah.
I wasn't talking about what does water flow downhill in this payday Friday. That was not my bailiwick. And if it was, I was in the wrong ballpark. So I would encourage your audience to think more strategically, to think about what they're doing that has an impact, not only in today's generation, but future generations. Somebody's going to look back someday and say, you know, that was a really good decision.
Yeah.
And you'd like to think that your name is associated with that. It probably won't be, but it might be. Your name is associated with that really good decision because you're able to bring leadership to the table rather than a managerial mindset.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I love that. I also love the fact that you said, you know, it's one of the things I learned as a mayor was to actually not be so afraid of being uncomfortable and holding space for the complexity of the decisions that we had to make. The complexity meaning the strategic nature and the uncertainty of the and the discomfort of the decisions that we had to make. It's interesting, and I'd be curious about your thoughts. I've got one last question for you. One of the things that I always tell folks is your job as elected official is to give intellectual consideration to what does our community want and need now and into the future, and what are they willing and able to pay for? And those two questions, although they might sound simple, they're not to be confused with easy, because really it's all the strategic, critical, philosophical conversations need to focus on what does our community want and need, and what are they willing and able to pay for. So I'd be curious what your thoughts around that question.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant way of presenting it. I just think that, you know, if you can get councils, excuse me, to think through where's the community at, and if it was to be deemed as a healthy community, where do we need to be going forward?
Yeah.
Where do we need to challenge ourselves? Where are our levels of discomfort that we need to rethink through and say, if we're going to be healthy in the next 5 or 10 years, let's keep that as our time horizon. What choices are we going to be faced with that we need to make as a community? That people are going to look back and say, you know, the reason I live here is because the leadership of this community is focused around young families. It's focused around open space. It's focused around a good balance between the environment and the economy, that we have an economic base that's sustainable. We've got a community that's sustainable. We want to make sure that we've got an outdoor environment that's respectful of the outdoors. We need to have those things in measure and in good balance. Mm-hmm. And how are we making decisions that would enable us to move forward in that direction? And that to me is a critical question for a council. Your role as the public stewards of this community. Your role is to understand that what you're doing are making choices on where this community is at and where it should be headed. That's a council role. It's not management. Management's role is to help you get there. The council's role is to help decide where there is. So let's talk about how do we define the there of a community. What does there look like to you as a council? Yeah. What do we want to become that we may not be? Let's not be foolish about it, but let's have some aspirational goals that cause us to think beyond ourselves. Yeah. You know, think about the next generation. What are we doing to make life better for them? That's all a part of being, in my mind, a thinking, worthwhile, progressive leadership council, as opposed to somebody that's asking the price of lumber at Home Hardware.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, George. As always, I mean, I don't get to talk to you very often, but I admire your work. It has informed my thinking and has made me a better mayor, and has actually informed my work that I'm doing now. So thank you for your wise and thoughtful mentorship over the years.
If I could get in one last comment, it would be a plug for, I've got 2 books that I've written during COVID times. One with my daughter, she did the illustrations. It's called Tucker Goes to City Hall. I'd really encourage that to mayors and council members because it's a great read. It's a thin book. It'd be easy to hand out to grade 5 or 6 classes because they're taking local government. You'd be a big hit as a political leader handing out a copy of the books to the children, and the proceeds go to a children's camp in Romania. So I don't get a nickel out of this. I don't get a nickel out of any of my books or videos. It's money that goes to support the development of a children's camp. If you're interested, drop me a note. And the second book is one that's yet to come out yet. It's called The Mayor. And it's going to be published in the next couple of months, again on Municipal World, so you can look for that one.
Perfect. That sounds great. And I once again, I completely appreciate your time and this conversation. I'm going to stop the recording now.